All 40 or so of you. This is John Kern from the AIMS Center, and we are back again this morning to take another swipe at collaborative documentation. And this will be a brief 30-minute webinar, going with our usual, our recent habit of brevity. And for those of you who were involved in a previous version of this where the internet gremlins got us, I apologize. And hopefully this will be worth coming back for. We'll move right ahead. Under Zoom housekeeping, this should be familiar to you by now. This call is being recorded. I don't see any reason why we'll be sharing PHI, since mostly it'll be me that's talking. And we'll keep you all muted, so everybody has a nice experience. And we will get going. Okay, so collaborative documentation refers to a practice of completing and sharing documentation in the presence of the client in a collaborative way. So basically this means while you're doing your clinical thing, you're documenting at the same time. And so classically this means you're sitting in the office, you're doing therapy, you're doing a psychiatric appointment, you're doing case management, and you're more or less typing as you go. Collaborative documentation refers to the practice of doing this in a planful, thoughtful way with the collaboration of your client. Concurrent documentation you will also hear used similarly, and that concurrent, of course, means at the same time, but not necessarily together. And that doesn't clarify the emphasis on a shared process, which I think is really important and one of the things that makes the difference between something that just is efficient and something that actually furthers the clinical process, which I think that collaborative documentation does too. Now, the point of us talking about this at all is in fact that for most people, one feels like one has a lot to do, one feels like one doesn't have very much time, one feels like one takes work home, which is not really a good thing. And so the virtues of efficiency are paramount for most people, but in fact, there are clinical improvements that go with it that I believe pretty strongly in, that I think are worth thinking about. The reason I'm giving this talk, in part, is I spent years and years providing this kind of training for the National Council for Behavioral Health in a prior life, and after having implemented this in my old community mental health center where I was the CMO. And so that's kind of my angle and my area of experience with it. But I do have years and years and years of doing this and helping my staff to do this. So the problems with clinical documentation, as usual, are there's too much of it. It takes too long, and it's often not that useful or helpful. The time you spend documenting expands the workday unnecessarily, and there is data to suggest for medical providers and also for behavioral health providers that this is probably the #1 thing that causes burnout and makes people unhappy with their jobs. So our mothers didn't raise us to write the treatment plan. We had in mind spending time with our clients or patients, and so this burden of documentation makes it so we spend a lot of time doing what we don't really want to do. And for most people, it means work outside what should be thought of as ordinary work time. One of the issues about the accuracy of documentation, if you're going to go to all the trouble to document, you want your documentation to be accurate. And if it's a long time between the time that you do whatever it is that you do with your client and when you write it down, the memory crumbles. The accuracy of things documented hours or days later is very poor. And what happens is over time, traditionally what used to happen, like for example, with physicians, is they would see all their patients and then they would sit down at the end of the day and write everything down. This is paper and pencil, or pen and paper. And what would happen is you can't. You think you can remember, but you can't. and notes become vague and generic and not that helpful and not that accurate. You can't really remember what you did and what was said. And what happens is the clinical record becomes notoriously useless. So there's a lot of it. It's thick. Well, it used to be thick when it was paper. And it's not particularly useful. You spend a lot of time making it, and it's not particularly useful. So none of these redound to our greater credit and pleasure in doing our clinical work. One of the things that happens, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, is your paper life is divorced from your clinical life. And increasingly, if you're trying to move efficiently through your day, people find themselves dragged inexorably in the direction of their paper life. They're getting things written down, they're writing things, and spending, God forbid, just enough time with their clientele to get the information for writing things down, which is not a really good direction to incentivize people toward. But that does seem to be what happens. Documentation competes with time spent with clients, and most people are familiar with this. The only way you get your paperwork done is if people don't show up, and no show means people aren't getting seen. So it's kind of a not very nice spiral. I think it's fair to say, and when I was working in a supervisory position, I felt this pretty strongly, that work shouldn't take up all your time. A lot of people spend time at the end of the day. A lot of people spend time at home after hours. And the question you want to ask yourself is, given that you're a human being, that you have limited capacity, you have X number of clinical activities to carry out, how do you want to spend your time? Do you want to spend it with your clients as opposed to other things you have to do or not? And in short, one of the things that what collaborative documentation permits is for you to spend more time in the presence of your client doing clinical work, and the documentation process is rolled up in that and folded into that, such that it's part of the clinical process and something that you do together with your client. And it both permits you to be involved in that way more than you would otherwise, and it also permits you to move efficiently through your work day, your work week. So these are the upsides. It saves time, creates capacity. If you get good at it, or even if you're doing your best, it does usually improve client engagement and involvement, and I'll show you the data to support that. It does help focus clinical work on outcomes, improve quality of work life, as we talked about for the reasons that I talked about, namely that there's less work or there's less time spent working. And it does keep you on top of your notes. I worked for some years in part-time as a consultant for an organization that provided administrative consultation to community mental health centers, and we had tons of data referring to the transition from the old-fashioned documentation to collaborative documentation. We found that full-time staff save 6 to 8 hours a week of work time in doing this. It seems like a lot, but that was in fact what we found. And I did this when I was a practicing psychiatrist, working in a community mental health center setting. I did this myself for years, and I did save quite a number of hours. I never counted exactly, but I can't tell you if somebody tried to make me stop doing it, we would have wrestled. Concerns of clinical staff in terms of doing this, in terms of doing documentation while you're with the client, is that it's not fair to clients. Their time is precious. Their time they deserve their own time, and this is somehow doing paperwork or filling up their time or making or sacrificing part of their time, and that collaborative documentation would take away from time and effort retention spent on treatment. The experience of clients. This is documentation from the organization I used to work for, NTM Services, and in the dozens of implementations that they did, they gathered data from clients on a number of things, both clients and providers, and what they found was that amongst these almost 29,000 clients, that most people felt that it was either very helpful or helpful. That's like 83%. And that's certainly that's certainly been my experience with it personally. So in thinking about how you go about it, it's helpful to start thinking about documentation as a tool for organizing the clinical work. The way I got started with this is I was doing psychiatric work with clients, and I would have them in my office. And when the computers started to appear, I'm a creature born in the paper era, but when there started to be a computer and there started to be an EHR, or even when the EHR was just getting started, I did have a computer on my desk, and we'd be talking about something, some medication, some issue, and we would look something up. We would Google something, and they'd say, where is the closest food bank, or how do you know about the interaction of these two medications? And I'd say, let's look it up. And so we would look it up together, and I'd say, look, it says here the food bank is down 2 blocks down and to the right, or it says that you were right, there is an interaction between these two medications. And so the experience of kind of using the computer as a tool that we did something together with, not just I didn't hoard it and say I'm going to look at some things, but you can't look at my screen. It was something we did together, and that was collaborative, and that felt good, and I think that it was part of an approach to the care of patients that was collaborative anyway. And so this was part of it. So when we started writing notes in the EMR, we started doing that together too. And I would be writing along, saying, and I would say, so now what did you say again about how your depression is, or what the voices are saying, or why it is that you changed your dose of medication, or what your mom said, and I would write it down, and they would say, yeah, that's how it was. So it's almost always possible to become more transparent as a provider. One of the problems with medical records in general, and with behavioral health medical records in particular, is the proclivity, at least historically, to think that the record belongs to us, that the record is a possession of the clinic or of the clinical provider. And I think it's much more. It in fact is the patient's chart. And the more that what we do with them is transparent, the more that we do with them is completely shared, the better it seems to work. But this does, especially in people who've been in the business for a while, this does run counter to tradition, to kind of having our own thoughts and our own private, keeping track of what's going on, different from what we talk with the patient about or the client about. So it's almost always to do better. It's almost always possible to do better with that. And if if you like the way that things have been working out with the time spent documenting and how your workday goes, you can keep doing things the same way, but you probably get the same results, as they say. So in terms of introducing it to your client, if you haven't already been doing this, what we suggest is you say, this is your treatment, this is your care, this is your chart, welcome to your chart. I want to actually accurately capture what you're saying, and I want the chart to reflect what we're actually doing, what you're actually getting, as opposed to my idea of what that is, and that this helps me do a better job. And so increasingly, they're part of the process. It's something you work on together. In terms of the actual process of writing notes, I will refer you to Strunk and White in the Elements of Style, the classic text in English style, and it's the first sentence or the first item in the list of the Elements of Style is omit needless words. I always thought it was omit needless words, omit needless words, omit needless words, because I always thought it was funny, because of course there's lots of needless words there. But apparently, I looked it up recently to do this presentation, and it's just one. And the idea here is that historically, documentation in behavioral health has been wildly over elaborate. And I had the experience not long ago of reviewing a chart of my own that I had been maintaining for 27 years for a client that, actually the very first client that I'd ever seen out of residency. I was still seeing 27 years later. And there, of course, it was like this, right? And so, and I went back and I looked at my notes from 1989, and it went on and on and on and on about what I thought about this and what I thought about that and what my theory was about this. And needless to say, I could have done less and expressed more. And so, so resisting the inclination to write down everything that occurs to one, or every single thing that the client says, is something worth resisting. You want to summarize rather than transcribe. And so what that means is when you're sitting with a patient and you're talking, you're talking. And then you, after a while, or maybe close to the end, you might say, now this is what I'm hearing, and this is what I think we're doing. Is that right? And then you can summarize rather than write down. And then everybody's been familiar with notes that you'll see where the client says this, client states this, client states this, client states this. And this is just a lot of moving your fingers. As Strunk says, a sentence should contain no unnecessary words, a paragraph no unnecessary sentences, for the same reason that a drawing should have no unnecessary lines and a machine no unnecessary parts. I just love that. But it's helpful to think about how could you tell the story of your encounter and what happens next, or what the plan is, briefly. These are the things you also want to think about as you're writing. You don't want to abandon your clinical style. You want to actually have the encounter with your client in the way you ordinarily would, in your usual way. But the collaboration with them is more like, how do you think this is going? What do you think the issues are? What do you think should happen next? And having that included in the documentation and treatment planning. Oops, excuse me. You always want to avoid jargon. Jargon is never helpful. And judgmental language. And you're going to be forced to avoid, especially judgmental language, if your client is sitting next to you watching the creation of the document that you're making. There may be situations where we will have disagreements. I'll talk about that in the next slide. And that's just life in the big city. The fact that you're working together on it and the client is sitting with you as you're doing it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to agree about everything. And this is often a healthy process. And even in situations where there's strong disagreement, it's reasonable to document this in the record. And here's some examples of how you might do this. I think that the requirement in this process, as you're having the client with you live, watching you do what you're doing, creates this necessity for tactful language. It keeps you in a therapeutic stance, and it keeps you from sliding silently into judgment and to shortcuts. And it motivates you to think and speak and write clearly, and think about what it is that you're doing with your client in a clear and client-centered way. So here are some examples. I might, instead of writing "client continues to be impossible to please," I might take a pause and take a deep breath and think about this from the client's point of view. They're upset about the changes I've made in their medications. They wanted that Xanax. We may have disagreements about diagnosis. I believe this patient is suffering from schizophrenia, and this patient believes that they have, in fact, ADHD. And so it's all right there. It's all black and white. We do have this disagreement. And when this is written, and when you're talking with your client about it, you're going to say, this is the size of things, isn't it? Would you agree that this is what I said, and this is what you said, and this is the source of our disagreement? And say, well, that's true. I still disagree, but that is true what you wrote. And that's, it's of course very helpful, I think, for the client to have the sense that they know what's in there. There's not all kinds of mysterious material about them. What do they really think? The more that it's transparent, I think the more useful that it is. And so when you're trying to drive focused treatment, you're making a plan. it's more popular. Everybody's familiar with the godforsaken behavioral health treatment plan that's 47 pages long. It has 17 sections and objectives and goals and observations, and gets written up and reviewed every 90 days, and nobody uses it for anything. If you're trying to do something that's a little more focused, it's much more powerful when you're actually talking to the client about it, as opposed to writing it when you're home over the weekend. If you're going to do skill building, you pay attention to what's actually going to happen between now and the next time you see the patient. And then you can catch up. And this is the next thing. The next thing is you can use the record as a tool. You could say, here's yesterday's note, or here's last week's note, and here's what we said we were going to do. How did that go? Or here's here's the list of treatment. Here's the note we got from your other doctor. Let's look at it. Let's make a plan for what we're going to do that will be able to easily access and actually use the documentation aspect of the record to use to keep us focused, keep us on track. And sometimes you don't have time to do everything, and so you say, next time, when we pick up next time, we're going to resume talking about this. So there's a bunch of logistics. So if you are doing this, then great. And if you're not, sometimes you have to actually do some logistical moving around. So for example, everybody's had the experience, I certainly have, if you go, now this happens everywhere. When I started talking about this, it was somewhat unusual. But now, you go to see your primary care provider, and what do? They come in, they sit down on the twirly stool, they've got their laptop, they swing around, they turn their back to you, and they start typing and talking. Now, not everybody does that, but it certainly happens a lot. I recently saw a training webinar, and there was some doc, and it was supposed to be an example of good doctoring, and he still did that. So that's not good. The kind of setup you want to move stuff around so that you do have a physical configuration that fosters this kind of work together. This can be done via telehealth, obviously, very easy. The other thing about this is you may not be a swift enough typist, or the whole process may there may be a learning curve to it, and there's no rule that says you have to do 100% of cases like this. There's no rule that says you have to do 100% of every note like this. You do as much as you can while you're learning how to do it, and you usually get better at it over time. If you discover that this doesn't work for you and you don't like it, then don't do it. But I think that it's my strong belief that it is actually a boon. It is actually a helpful thing. It does actually make your life better, just because it shortens the time devoted to work. And so it's worth trying to spend some effort learning to do. In terms of, can you do this with everybody? No. In my hands, it was about 85% of the time. Sometimes people are too upset. Sometimes there's too many people in the room. Sometimes, any one of 1,000 things. But about 85% of the time I could actually do it. And then, on other occasions, there were other things that were more important, and I had to catch up later. That's, I think, pretty typical. So you actually have to move the furniture if you need to. This picture up here is actually me, and this is not actually my client. This is my secretary at the time. But this is where my patients or clients would sit, and we'd look together at the computer, and we'd talk, and I'd write stuff down, or we'd look things up, or we'd Google things. And that was pretty acceptable to patients. They could see, they could read it. I'd write it, and I'd say, is that right? That's what the voices are saying. I'd say, that's what your dose of medication is. That's where you're going on vacation, whatever it is. The client needs to be able to see the screen. This doesn't work. This would work. And I actually have come to feel over the years that the notion of moving to an older kind of model, where you were not even sitting at the same desk, but you're sitting in two separate chairs, to a model where you're side by side with the client, working together. I think that's a great just conceptual philosophical shift, and I felt that it affected my work pretty strongly. So I did this at the old mental health center I used to run. I did this. You'll see, this is back in the Flintstone era, so that's when we did it. And it was a medium, large size mental health center. At that time, 7 psychiatrists, later 13. And so we did this slowly with the psychiatrist first, actually, and then with everybody else later. And the things that, and it was generally well accepted, though not 100% by far, even though I was like the flag waver for this. People wanted to, we thought people who go poorly feel caught up all day. That's a big thing. It's a big thing if you go into your session, you feel caught up. And you're not thinking, oh my God, I've got all these other things I'm going to do. You can actually be present and say, okay, I'm here with you. You have my full attention. And that is surprisingly huge. As I said, not everybody did it. Those that do it, some people just want to hang around the office, I swear. And those people went home later, by golly. And some people have trouble with the computer. This led to briefer and more focused sessions for, especially for my psychiatrists, less time searching for data old labs. That was from the paper days. And our waiting list went way down, way down. Notes got done. We went from 143 to 4 missing progress notes. And clients liked it. They'd say things like this. It must be important if you're writing it down. And they'd say, make sure you also say so-and-so. Or they'd say, look up how I was doing last year when we did this. We had no complaints. We had 0 complaints after thousands of sessions. Now, other people may have other experiences, but that was our experience. We have a few minutes left. This is some things that come up. If a client says, I don't want to document during a session, then you don't do it. It's easy. It doesn't happen very often. What if you have a different perspective than the client? We talked about this, about disagreeing with both the points of view in the note, so it's clear. What if the client says they don't want me to record something in their chart? I think that this can be dealt with via tact. Usually, it's usually something embarrassing, and I don't think that's so hard to do, to move toward generalities. Now, the chart doesn't have to contain every single thing about every single patient. There's such a thing as things that are clinically relevant and impact decision making, and things that don't. And how do I document something I don't want the client to see? I think this should be vanishingly rare. I think where we should be working toward finding a way to put into words what we want to do with the clients in such a way that they will feel acceptable to them. Okay, 828, excuse me. And now Sarah Barker from the AIMS Center is going to talk about what comes next.
All right, great. Thanks, John. That was really helpful. So upcoming, we have a psychologist, Dr. Patrick Rowie, who's on faculty with us. He's going to be presenting our next webinar around Stay Connected, telephone-based behavioral health strategies to reach isolated patients. He focuses on strategies around anxiety, as well as patient activation for depression. This is really great. This is meant, the audience can be anyone from, your case managers, navigators, care coordinators in the field doing this work, to licensed individuals as well. So that's coming up on June 24th, and there'll be a deeper dive into patient activation on July 7th as well. And Sarah, I know, is coordinating all of this with us from Better Health Together, so feel free to reach out to her or to us at the AIMS Center with questions. So I think we have like 1 more minute left. Julia, do we have the poll today? Do you want to put that up? So we'd love to hear what you thought of the session today. If there are any burning questions, I guess you could write them in really fast into the chat box from today's webinar. Thanks, Sarah, for sharing the registration information. John, you got 1 question. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I was just reading. Thank you, Thank you, Kay Beard. Losing connection during collaborative documentation. I assume that means, your internet goes out. That could never happen, only to me. I think that doing it collaborative concurrent documentation on paper and transcribing into EMR later. That's, as I think that has the virtues of doing it together. It has those virtues, and it has less virtue in terms of saving time. So, or maybe even does something depending how quickly you transcribe. So it's so I would suggest a quality improvement approach, trying to see how you can become more efficient and have more of your own time available to you. Okay, we're at time. See everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks everyone. Don't forget to see Dr. Rowie. It'll be fun. See you again. Bye-bye.